Hello, Kirsten. Hello, Jeff. There you are.
There I am.
How are you?
Good. How are you, Mike?
Doing really, really well.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
Hello, Jeff. I am so excited for you two coming on. Thank you for joining.
Oh, pleasure.
I think back to the experiences I've been able to have with the two of you in conversation, and right away it just brought that emotion back because there's just so much joy in those conversations.
Yeah.
Exploring innovation and exploring what's possible in education, and I want to first of all start with congratulating both of you on your book, because it's so needed. The time is so critical. And then the exploration and the conversations you're having around that with leaders in education through these challenging times is, it's just a brilliant exploration that we need, that's going to serve all of us so well. So heartfelt thank you for all of that. As way of introduction, I just wanted to share that appreciation because it's so much fun having conversations with you, right? Because you open up and you explore so open-mindedly, and and you bring that depth of experience.
Thanks, Mike. That's really great. We are both, Jeff and I are both really, really thrilled to be here. And when you told us about this event and you said it was a rally, I was in, because right now it's all about rallying the troops. It's all about coming together, getting together around heart-centered thinking, and really exploring that. So we're just really honored to be here. And you mentioned that we had just finished doing some amazing interviews. And really, Jeff and I have a very long background in education. We've been supporting educators for years. And so when COVID hit, the first thing we thought of is, wow, what's happening in the schools? And so we started this exploration, and I'll let you say more about it, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mike. I was hearing actually everything that you were saying twice, so I missed much of the introduction because I think I hadn't turned my volume off. But anyway, it's an honor to be here, Mike. I've looked forward to this, and I have to say, Kirsten and I have interviewed a number of the people that have spoken today. I'm not going to name names because I'll always leave somebody out, and then I'll hear later, why didn't you mention me? I'm not going to mention that. But the other thing that's so amazing is that I've seen a lot of faces and names come up in various circumstances. So it's really been great for me to put that voice to a name, to a face, and I thank you for organizing this, Mike. It's been very special.
Well, it's special for me to have you with us, and I do appreciate that. And we do have a network that goes back to NLV and a lot of people connecting there. And I think it's all of those communities that have been building relationships for so long. There's depth in that, and as we all come together and support each other, I think there's great hope for sustainability to a lot of this change that's happening, and the shifts and the shifting that needs to take place. Shifting happens to be the name of this great new book that you two have co-authored. And Kirsten, you mentioned that the pivot for education, and I don't believe it's called out enough. We think of the education system as kind of being that big organization, institution that can never change, but we always point at them and say, oh, if they just did that right, and if they would just, right, we all point our fingers and have opinions of it, but we don't realize there's so much involved. There's so many constraints. At the same time, this thing hits, And in a matter of 2 weeks, every school in the nation that have thousands of kids at every different age with every need we could imagine, every different level of challenge and need has to be converted into a brand new environment that has never been done.
Yeah.
And they did it. They did it. And they're doing it. And it's not easy. Yeah. There's challenges. And I think if there's any group of people that have demonstrated what's possible when we have to do something, I applaud and bow to those in education that are making it happen. And then again, want to thank you both and call out the work you're doing to put the right lens on that and to highlight not only that great work, but the great possibilities of where we can innovate and what's possible in the future.
Yeah, it's really amazing the kind of response that's going on right now. We really think about these education leaders and everyone in education as being on the front lines. And you don't normally think of schools as front lines, but this is what it is. These people are one of the core organizations in every community. They have the widest reach to families, and they really have a central spot in the community, and that really comes through when you talk to them about how this is happening and what they're needing to do. So it's been a really important learning journey to talk to them and to kind of hear. We were so fortunate to hear from these people who are really showing the shift that is needed right as this is happening.
Yeah, Mike, you mentioned our book, and we actually have a third author on the book. And Margaret could not be here today because she is serving on the front lines. She is an interim principal in Wethersfield, Connecticut. And it was actually in a conversation with Kirsten and me where we got this idea, because Margaret was literally thrown right back into the mix. This school had no principal, and she had been a principal in the district, and they asked her to come back. And we started having this conversation, and it was like, we got to talk about this. This is, I mean, what folks are going to be going through here is massive. So that's why that's one of the reasons we undertook it.
Yeah, and I love that, and thank you for bringing her up. I was remiss to do that, so I'm happy that you brought her into that conversation. And you know, the one thing that occurred in listening to these conversations is none of them are concerned about their jobs or what they're doing or how challenging it is. Their focus is still on all of those lives that they're serving. Isn't that amazing? They care about the opportunities and the experiences that are going to be missed by these seniors that aren't going to have the traditional path out of school. And the challenges that they're having for each of those kids that have a need that isn't being addressed now because the community that they live in for so many hours during the day isn't there for them. And you know, it's just resounding again and again and again through every one of those voices.
Yeah.
They care about the children. It's about the experience of others, never about themselves. And it's a fabulous example that I hope we don't miss, that we can continuously revisit. Because if we saw that care and compassion in all other elements of our society, we would be winning every day.
That's right. That's right. That was what was one of the amazing things. One of our questions was, what's foremost on your mind? And you think that, like you said, they had to turn on a dime, they had to make instruction happen in such a short period of time. Actually, the very first thing, almost invariably out of their mouth, was not that. It was totally about supporting people. Jeff, you want to say more?
Well, yeah, I mean, that gets us into what we really wanted to talk about. When we first got the idea, Mike, we didn't want to do a quantitative survey. We didn't want to send out a a survey monkey, with a bunch of questions. We wanted to have dialogue with people because Kirsten's a university professor. I was a high school history teacher. We both worked for the largest educational publisher for many, many years together. We've written this book about educational change. We wanted to talk to educators, and we didn't want to just read numbers. So with your help, Mike, the first person that we interviewed was Carol Campen. I'll get to Carol in just a minute, but we set about to interview faculty members, administrators, school administrators, superintendents, assistant supes, principals, and we actually got to interview one teacher. We found one teacher who was going to be able to be freed to be able to talk to us. Had to get district permission and all of that. And it was these were amazing conversations. We said we were going to limit these to 15 to 20 minutes out of respect for their schedule, and they usually took us longer, because their hearts were just beating about what it is that they were trying to do on behalf of their kids and their faculties. You cannot leave one of these interviews and not feel inspired by what they're trying to do in literally no time.
I love that. What I would like to do is step out of the way, give the stage to both of you, and please explore and go deeper and have some fun. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So with that introduction, Kirsten mentioned one of the questions that we asked people in the interviews. We also sent them these questions ahead of time so that they could be thinking about them. What is foremost on your mind? What obstacles have you encountered? What are you most proud of? How are you taking care of yourself? And what is one piece of advice you would have for fellow educators? Now, we didn't expect them to respond to each of those questions. That wasn't the goal. We wanted them to kind of lead the discussion, if you will. So what follows, what Kirsten and I want to provide are some of our observations, what we heard. And these fall into three themes that we will review. But we're also going to sprinkle in some quotes from the actual educators because we wanted you to hear their voices. That's really what's powerful here is to hear them talk. Kirsten?
So one of the people that we heard from was Carol Campa, and actually Mike introduced us to her. And she is the principal of John F. Kennedy High School in Bloomington, Minnesota, and she summarized what was going on for her as a lot of leaders are managers, and so sometimes in a crisis they fall back into that management mindset. I'm a big believer in three component frameworks. There's management, there's instruction, and then there's support. And those leaders with management mindsets really need to challenge themselves to step back from the one they're most comfortable with and figure out ways to support their staff, their students, and their families. So that's right back at what Mike was talking about leading from the heart, right? And when we talked to our co-author, Margaret Sakai, she explained what that support looked like from her perspective. She said that the main thing that is so important is that I am constantly reaching out to my staff to ask, what do you need? What kind of learning do you need? What kind of support do you need? Where are you feeling overwhelmed? And where can we have other team members step in? And Sahara Valentine, who is the principal of Baltimore Design School, also talked about that relationship between self-care and care for students. She said, I believe that when you don't ask adults what they need, that often translates to how they support students. So I think it's really important as a leader that you model self-care with staff so that it translates when they speak to students. A faculty member's self-care plan has three components. How are you taking care of yourself? How are you taking care of those that you love? And how are you aligning your efforts and your time to support the scholars at Baltimore Design School? Those are the questions she asked her staff.
Right. So what were some of the obstacles that they encountered when they're trying to provide this social and emotional support. The big thing, as we've said, it wasn't that instruction wasn't a big issue, but the first thing that they were focusing on was making connections. And you can only imagine how challenging this is, especially with the younger kids. The older kids could eventually get onto a Zoom room like we're doing here today, or Microsoft Teams. But the younger kids, it wasn't really easy to reach them that way. So we've talked to some educators about this, and what they wound up doing in some cases was having their teachers actually call each of the students or each of the parents just to make that home connection. And the same was true for faculty members. The superintendents were very concerned about their faculty because they're dispersed as well. So their advice was to department heads was to have regular department meetings, much like we're doing here today via Zoom. And one of the benefits that came out of this, it may be a small one, but it may not be, is that in certain situations where principals are used to going to visit with the superintendent for a big meeting, they would often have to drive. And in some cases, we talked to one superintendent, he had one principal who was driving a half an hour. We talked to people in Los Angeles, they were driving 2.5 hours each way to get to these kinds of meetings. So after the discovery of Zoom for these people, they have now cut those out, those face-to-face meetings out entirely, and going forward, they're going to have Zoom chats. The other issue here, and we'll talk about the digital divide in just a minute, but the real issue that they were wrestling with, most of these schools are serving up 1 to 2 hot meals a day for their kids who come from impoverished homes or impoverished communities. And when everybody went into lockdown, so to speak, the question then became, how do we feed our kids? How do we feed these kids? And there were some really interesting solutions that came about. Some of the schools that we talked to were still cooking hot meals, but they had, of course, they had to obey the social distancing. And then they had to transfer the hot meals curbside. That had to be done social distancing. Then they had to set up an area where parents could come in and pick up the meals. Now that works in an urban environment or in a suburban environment, but a lot of areas in the US are still fairly rural. So what we found was that they were delivering hot meals via bus or via van. We talked to a superintendent / principal in the UK. His name is Vic Goddard. And Vic came up with a very interesting solution, which was to take the money that the national government provides for these hot meals, and he partnered with a local grocery store, and the grocery store printed vouchers, and then Vic gave the vouchers out to the family. So he was able to continue this hot meal program by basically giving the same amount of money, but back to the parents who could then buy the groceries and cook the meals. And this program was so successful that the national government picked it up and has now spread it over the UK. So that's just an example of somebody really thinking things through and thinking larger than himself or his local community.
Yeah, and really thinking about supporting those needy students first, right? Another big theme that came up when we talked to the educators was how varied their situations were. You know, Mike talked about the fact that education, we tend to see education as this monolithic big thing, right? But actually it's quite different from place to place. And so when we talked to the educators, we talked to all of these people that had quite different circumstances. So in some places, the educators really were just focusing on, hey, the students had live instruction between the fall and the third quarter. Let's keep them from losing what they learned. That's what we intend to do during this period, right? Some other places said, no, we're actually going to do some new instruction so that they do have instruction between now and the end of the year. Another thing that really varied from place to place was whether they intended to do synchronous learning or asynchronous learning. So in other words, do they have real-time teaching, Or is their intention to actually post assignments and post resources that the students could access 24/7, which was really important because sometimes people can't, if the parent or other siblings in the household are using the computer or using the internet access, they might have to juggle between things. So that might be a solution. Another thing that we heard was that in some places, especially rural areas, and in some parts, in some communities, there's not an equity of access in terms of digital. So in those remote areas, they actually were thinking in this time of remote teaching, they were actually relying on paper packets, right? So there was really this vast spectrum of digital access, and they were really trying to address inequities as they thought through how to pivot on a dime, like Mike said. So, when we talked to these educators, they were really thinking about, look, if there's so much variety here, we really need to think about being very flexible and also being in good communication with each other, right? So one of the people we talked to, her name was Jill Geocaris. She was the Director of Innovative Adult Learning for District 207 in Park Ridge, Illinois. And she explained, our state guidance has been that our kids' academic standing can't be harmed by e-learning or remote learning. So it's a great opportunity for us to have our teachers thinking about how we get to a place where we're not just teaching to a grade and we're not going for that carrot or stick. So teachers are really thinking about, how can I design some engaging learning that's either synchronous or asynchronous and have kids engage in that.
And just a side note here, all states have suspended their end of year high stakes assessments. And you could almost feel a sigh of relief coming from the school districts that didn't have, I personally think they're hideous, these abusive end of the year tests that kids have to take and that teachers have to administer and that people are teaching and learning to all year long. They've been suspended. And one of the discussions we hope that comes out of this is there anything that we can do about not having these types of tests, but rather move to much more of a project-based learning environment where kids are assessed on what they're able to do, not just filling in little blanks on an assessment sheet. But to follow up on Kirsten's point, one of the things that came out of the discussion around digital learning was the impact on parents, because especially in younger homes or even in middle school where connectivity may be an issue, a lot of districts were relying on the parents to be a connecting partner. And with parents often working now at home, both have brought their jobs at home. There are other kids in the house. This is really a situation that's challenging. We talked to a gentleman, his name is Steve Miletto, and Steve is the director of the Heart of Georgia Regional Education Service Agency in Georgia. And an ESA it's a quasi-governmental agency that sits between the state educational organization and local districts. And what Steve and other ESA directors do is they service a whole range of districts in their territory. So he had a very expansive view of what was going on. Here's what he said about this question impacting parents. Online teaching isn't just giving a whole bunch of work. Online teaching requires us to connect with a family and make sure that their child is online when they need to be online. It's about getting information to parents to help them understand that by having their children at home, the best things they can do is follow a schedule like their child would during the school day. Now, that sounds easy, but it wasn't always easy. It's one of those things that they're really trying to solve for. So we've talked so far about social and emotional support. We've talked about a little bit about the digital divide and the constraints around digital divide. The third area that came up loud and clear was around leadership. And we talked to a superintendent in Illinois, Dr. Dave Schuler, High School District 214 in Arlington Heights. And he said something, and I've read this a half a dozen times. It still gives me goosebumps when I read what he says. As educational leaders, this is our time to step up. There are few people in a community that have a greater impact on families than principals and school superintendents. It is our obligation and our awesome opportunity to walk people through this and give them the confidence that we will get out on the other side of this in a positive way. He is on the phone with government officials. He's on the phone with people running businesses. He's on the phone with parents all the time, carrying out this message. And as he told us, he's working, and he didn't say this in a bragging sense, he's literally working 12-hour days, 7 days a week. And many of his staff are too, just to try to get communication to people about what the district is doing on behalf of the kids. Kirsten mentioned Zahara Valentine. She's the principal of the Baltimore Design School. She had a very interesting take on leadership. And she was really looking at it, at leadership, not as a title, not as a bronze plaque above the door or something on the principal's desk. She said, for other school leaders, I would add, don't be afraid to manage up. Many of our district leaders are understandably disconnected from what's occurring at the school level. Some of the policies or expectations may not quite align to the real work. Speak up with a solution. It's easy to find an issue. It's more skillful and solutions oriented if you see a problem of practice and couple it with a solution. If not, save your criticism. This really gets to the heart of why we did this. We wanted these people to be giving information to other educators and be giving license to really lead at whatever level they are. And finally, on this idea of leadership, and we have Gary Turner to thank here because Gary made the connection for us. We talked to Richard Gerver, who is simply an amazing thought leader. He is a UK-based education transformation advocate, and he works with schools all over the UK. And he's been observing and supporting their efforts throughout. He said, what we've seen in the last few weeks is the extraordinary natural talent, passion, and commitment of a brilliant group of people who, because of horrific events, have been set free to focus on children in their care. We've seen unbelievable levels of innovation, entrepreneurship, leadership at every level, extraordinary ability to not just cope with change, but to take control of it and make something meaningful from it. Important words there are set people free. They're out of the bureaucracy and they're able to handle things at the local level, which is critical.
Yeah, really, really inspiring. In addition to those big three themes, we also heard these heart-centered leaders give some practical advice because we asked them sort of what is one thing you would advise other educators? And they said, be patient, go slow, and celebrate the little steps. They said, communicate, 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 and also don't try to be perfect, right? Less is more. Do something, work through it, learn, share, do something else, right? And that was so beautifully summarized by Kim Pence, who's the Associate Director of Middle School Teaching and Learning in Forest Hills School District in Anderson, Ohio. And she said, we've trained our teachers along the way to be patient in their communication with families and try not to introduce a whole lot of tools that their students aren't familiar with and that might be overwhelming for them and overwhelming for their families. So we're trying to slow down. We don't need to be perfect. So
just to conclude here, if you're curious about what else these educators said, you can listen to the episodes on our Apple podcast. It's called Getting Unstuck Shift for Impact. Getting Unstuck Shift for Impact. Or you can go to my website, www.quetico, Quetico, coaching.com. Got all of the episodes there. It's amazing, inspiring work that these people are doing. Thank you, Mike, for the opportunity to share that.
Oh, thank you both so much for bringing that forward and sharing all those different perspectives in those conversations that you've had. And then summarizing into those big areas of concern, which are not just school concerns, right? Those are our societal concerns. And it does take that private public partnership to really help move this forward. And each of you are standing in that gap, being that bridge right now. And it's such important work. And my encouragement would be to, instead of saying, if you're interested, take a look at these conversations, I would invite you and encourage you to go seek out that information, because there's not only great learning about the most important piece of our future, which is our children and the education, but how we can step in and create that bridge and hold space for all of those that are in need. And you've taken the responsibility. It's an invite for all of us to step in and contribute as we can. And I think
well
both
said,
of
Mike.
you, it's fabulous leadership. And I really,
Well said.
Thanks.
Whether you're a parent or not, this is important work, because if you have kids, you want to know what the schools are doing on their behalf. Now, if you're not a parent, you want to know what schools are doing to lead us into the 21st century. So thanks, Mike.
And now is the time not to just go back to normal, like you said, Mike, to dream bigger. And getting involved in the schools and thinking about the future of education is all of our responsibilities right now.
love it. Thank you both very much. It brought such richness into this day for me and for all of us. I really appreciate both of you.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Have a great evening.
You too, man.